So we ended last week's class on verse 3 of the foundation of all good qualities, which is the lamrim prayer that we're going to use for that we've been using and that we will be using today and next week, as a way of talking about, providing an overview of all of the Buddhist sutra teachings primarily. So we ended on this verse here, verse 3, where the concepts of impermanence and death are introduced, and then also karma is introduced. And I think we were able to address, the aspect of that related to impermanence and death. And then what we said was that we would move into the teachings on karma to begin. So that is what we will do. So again, that's where it says, just like a shadow follows the body, the results of black and white karma follow. So here, black and white is a poetic way of talking about positive and negative, or sorry, I don't know how I turn that off. Positive or negative or constructive or destructive karmas. So I think we may have alluded to this scheme of positive and negative before. It is not, we addressed, at least to some degree, the understanding that karma isn't a moralistic system. It is an observation by the Buddha. So, what I mean by a moralistic system is something that is designed to result in pro-social behavior or to bring about social order, or something that's primarily concerned with the idea of rights and responsibilities. It isn't anything like that. The Buddha's observation, everything that the Buddha taught was his own direct observation. And one of those observations is that when actions of body, speech, and mind are intentionally engaged in, there is an energy in the mind that accompanies that action. And if the action was motivated by the wish to cause harm to another sentient being, then that energy brings about a suffering result, because the mind in which that energy resides after the engaging in the action, um, that mind bears a deep and subtle relationship to reality. And so that relationship can bring about that suffering result. And likewise, a positive action, one in which the intent was to bring benefit, will bring a beneficial or positive result in the future when that karma ripens. So we can talk about the creation of karma and then the ripening of karma, or sometimes referred to as karma and its effects. So that's the next major topic so we're going to go into verse 4, which is where this is introduced and then explained in more detail. So this is the text of verse 4, finding firm and definite conviction in this, and by this, Lama Tsongkhapa means verse 3, finding firm and definite conviction in both, you could say both the, the fact that this precious, perfect human rebirth is slipping away, moment by moment by moment. We're moving toward body and mind being separated, and this specific opportunity, ceasing. And then also the results of black and white karma ripening at the time of death. And we'll go into kind of why that's specifically important. Um, so finding firm and definite conviction in those two, you know, what, what at this point you would say are assertions about I mean, of course, we can validate on our own the assertion that our life is impermanent. That is relatively obvious. Um, the assertion that after death, that the results of positive and negative karma have an influence, that is not easily validated. That is what is called a deeply hidden phenomena, the intricacies of karma. So, deeply hidden phenomena are not there's manifest phenomena like gross impermanence, which is kind of what I was initially alluding to, the fact that, one example is that human beings age and that human beings die. We can simply look with our ordinary senses in the world and validate that for ourselves. Subtle impermanence is what's called a slightly hidden phenomena, which is the understanding that the aging process, for example, isn't something that happens in, like all at once. It isn't something like, oh, you had a birthday and now you are 1 year older. And prior to that, you didn't really age, but every year on your birthday, you become 1 year older and you have a certain number of years and you have these sort of events, these kind of moments where this aging kind of happens. And that isn't accurate. Every single moment of our lives, we age. Um, but we can't observe that. We can't observe that momentary change with our senses because it's happening on the from nanosecond to nanosecond. It's happening on the molecular, subatomic level. And it's that accumulation of changes that result in manifest change, or result in the manifest phenomena of gross or coarse impermanence. But still, we can reason out using logic, using reason. We can reason out that it must be true that um, impermanence doesn't have these sudden, large kind of jumps where nothing changed and then something changed in a really big way. Like we might notice a wrinkle or a gray hair, but we can say, well, definitely it isn't true that all of a sudden my body kind of spontaneously manifested all of the changes that were necessary for that wrinkle or that gray hair to appear. That is a course result of a very, very long, permanent, well, not but ubiquitous process of accumulating momentary changes. So if we apply ourselves and we use logic and we use reason, we can see how, even though it's a slightly hidden phenomena, we can see how it is valid, how it must be true. But karma is a deeply hidden phenomena, so we really can't use reason or logic to arrive at a firm, definite understanding just with ordinary mind. Um, they would say, the teachings would suggest that we can develop our minds to the point where, for example, another deeply hidden phenomena is rebirth. Um, and we also, that is also for us at this moment an assertion that the Buddha made that we can't puzzle out just using logic and reasoning. But what they say with regard to rebirth is that at a certain point of development, we have memories of our past lives. And even at a certain point in development beyond that, we can develop some clairvoyance about future lives. So there comes a point in spiritual growth and development where a person who progresses to that point has unshakable faith or conviction in rebirth because they have memory of their own rebirths. Um, and in a way, it's similar to this idea that so it's important to understand then for in the Buddhist context, there isn't anything that is unknowable. There are things that are unknowable for certain kinds of minds. And that's, but we know that that's true just in an ordinary sense as well, because we may wish to understand some topic that, like the writings of, Kierkegaard or what have you, something that's pretty obtuse. And we might develop an interest in it one day, but that doesn't mean that that day we understand those writings or we understand this subtle, obtuse philosophical point in, the writings of so and so, or this really difficult mathematical, proof for quantum mechanics or what have you. Um, but we do understand that there are people on the earth who do understand those things. And we can develop our minds to be able to understand those things given enough time, enough dedication, enough effort. For the most part, some people may, due to an injury in their brain or something, it could be that that's blocked for them in that life. That's true. And that might be true for a person also, um, with regard to certain levels of spiritual development. They may also depend upon a normally functioning mental system. So that's fair. But in general, if we do have a normally functioning system, we know that with time, with energy, with effort, with perseverance, we could become someone who's an expert in those things. And Buddhism is saying the same thing. It's just a little bit different because there are many more people on our planet who are applying themselves toward understanding those mathematical teachings, those philosophical teachings. Um, and there aren't there are many fewer people who are developing meditative concentration to these incredibly high levels, and so on. So different it's a different prevalence in the world, and that makes it seem different. But really, it isn't different. There isn't anything that can be known. There isn't anything that can be presented as an object of knowledge that we can't perceive. We just have to develop our minds to that level. But at present, our minds can't validate independently the teachings on karma. That's certainly true. I will really try not to move my hand because I don't know why it's kind of this feature of this program that I'm using, but I don't really know the advantage of it. Um, but I don't know how to turn it off. So any thoughts or questions so far? Nope. Okay. So we're going to start then by talking about what's called a complete karma. So a karma, as I alluded to, is an action of body, speech, or mind. The word karma means action, but as I also alluded to, really what the Buddha is concerned about is what is motivating the action. The action itself is a proxy for the motivation. The action is something that brings about the motivation. Um, we may, for example, with regard to, like, say, the physical action of eating, we might be, it might have been a really long time since we ate, right? It might be 5 or 6 hours since we ate, and so where there's grumbling in our stomach, we feel a bit lightheaded, so we're like, oh wow, I really need to eat something. We're like genuinely hungry. We could also be bored, or we could be stressed out, or we could be anxious or depressed. And so in that case, we might turn to food because, and maybe probably in that scenario, probably not the best kinds of food because we're sort of looking for a hit of dopamine, serotonin, what have you, um, from fatty foods or sugary foods. So we're using, and so in both cases, a person is consuming food. But in the one case, they're doing it just because it's time to eat and they want to nourish their bodies. And in another case, they're doing it to kind of change their mental state. They're doing it to kind of make their day better. Um, so outwardly, you've got the exact same action, but the motivation is very different. The reason why the person is engaging in that action is not the same. And that's what is important for the Buddha. What the Buddha cares about really is what was that person's motivation? Why did they choose to engage in that action? Because that is what they're becoming more and more familiar with by engaging in that action. When a person, only if a person trains themselves, for example, to use food as fuel, as nourishment primarily, um, and they only eat when they're hungry, then that that is a training of the mind. If a person trains themselves to turn toward food in order to feel better about what's happening and so on, then each time they engage in that action, each time they bring in food or drink or alcohol or whatever it might be, then they are becoming more, they're sort of strengthening that pattern. They're strengthening that tendency of when this arises, this is how I'm going to react. This is what I'm going to do. Um, and there are some habit patterns that are more constructive than other habit patterns. And the Buddha is concerned about and is encouraging us to really focus on developing the most constructive, most beneficial habit patterns or tendencies in the mind. Um, so even though the word karma means action, really what we want to focus on is the motivation behind the action. So there are two types of, in terms of this way of talking, there are two types of karma: complete karma and incomplete karma. They're both karmas, they both are relevant, but complete karmas are more powerful than incomplete karmas. Um, so if we use a couple of examples to explain this sort of diagram that we have, when we are engaging in an action, there is oftentimes a sentient being that we are in relationship to with regard to the action. Um, we might be speaking to someone, we might be doing something, we're engaging in some action that's oftentimes there's a sentient being in front of us, and we are, through our actions, relating to them in a particular way. We are telling them the truth, we are telling them a lie, we are speaking kindly, we are speaking unkindly, we are trying to be generous toward them. We are trying to be stingy or miserly. We are giving them something. We are taking something from them. We're very often relating to other sentient beings through our action. Sometimes it's an inanimate object, and so kind of the object is sort of ourselves in that case. The kind of the object of the action is really something arising in our own mind that we're trying to deal with, and we're relating to it through an inanimate object like food or alcohol or something. Um, but if it's sorry, um, so. So the basis, one example of the basis would be like an insect, let's say. If we're going to talk about a negative karma in relation to an insect, it could be a bug in our kitchen. And we might, so the basis would be observing that bug in our kitchen. Um, and we then develop an intention when we observe that bug in our kitchen. We're not observing like bugs in general, right? It is one specific bug that is in our kitchen. If we were in someone else's kitchen, we may not develop the same intention toward that bug, or if we were in a public place, or even if we were outside. But because it is our kitchen and we don't like bugs in our kitchen, we want our, we think of where we live as being, ours, and we don't want it to be invaded by bugs of any kind, then we develop some hostility to that particular bug. We may not be hostile, to bugs in general. We may like, we might feel kind of neutral toward bugs, but this one particular bug is something that we feel hostile to because it's in our space. So if there is hostility, then we might develop the intention to squash the bug. On the positive side, we might see the bug and we might think, oh, it would do better if it was outside where it could get food and water and what have you. So our intention might be to pick the bug up and to relocate it. Or, even if we're not super thrilled that there's a bug in our kitchen, we might, the thought might arise, well, the bug's life is important to the bug, it cares about its existence as, insofar as bugs can, it moves away from noxious stimuli and it moves toward, pleasant stimuli. And so it has an interest in survival. And so I'm not excited about it, but I'll go ahead and pick it up and take it outside. So we develop some intention either to squash it or to help it. And then we engage in an act. And this is why I said that the act is really just a proxy for the intention, because the act is, here it's two different actions, either squashing or picking it up. But because the intent was different. The intent was either to take its life or preserve its life. And we engage in an action that's designed to bring about that intended result. We want to kill it or we want to help it. So then we figure out some sort of plan of action that we think is going to bring about that result. And then we engage in that action, and there's the completion of that action. Either we actually do take its life, or we actually do go outside and put it in the grass, what have you, and it goes on its merry way. And then, either way, the action is complete. Um, so if all four of these factors are complete, then you have a complete karma. If you, for example, if one of these factors is incomplete, then you have an incomplete karma. So, for example, you might see the bug, you might develop the intent to harm it, and you might hit it. You might, pick up your shoe and smack the ground, but maybe it moves out of the way. And maybe it then goes underneath the oven or something and you can't find it and you just sort of give up. So the bug is fine. The bug, was unharmed, but it was only unharmed because it got out of the way. You really wanted to take its life and you tried. But there was no completion because it was actually unharmed. So it's a negative karma in that instance, but it's an incomplete negative karma because it would be worse if you actually were successful, if your action actually brought about that result, then it would be worse. It would be a heavier negative karma. So that's really the distinction, is that a complete karma where all of these factors, and could also be that you initially, perhaps the intention arose to take its life, but then you talked yourself out of it. You were like, no, that's a negative action. I'm trying to be more compassionate. That's an old habit pattern. I'm really trying to work on new habit patterns. So, maybe I will at least leave it alone, or maybe I'll do something beneficial, but I'm going to talk myself out of going forward. So then you've kind of cut that even earlier, which is even better. You did still have that kind of thought of ill will toward the bug did arise in the mind, and that's not ideal. You don't, ideally you wouldn't want to have thoughts of ill will toward sentient beings. Um, but then you adjusted, and that's better than actually engaging in the act. And then that's also, of course, the completion is the heaviest point where you've actually succeeded. And of course, if there's a positive action, then you want to go all the way to the completion of the act, because that's the most positive action. You don't want that to be interrupted. And it's also possible that it could be interrupted, right? The thought of generosity might arise in your mind. But then you might think, oh, but actually I want to buy this thing. And if I give away my resources, maybe I won't be able to buy this thing that I want. So you had this impulse of generosity, but then kind of a negative, sort of miserly mind arose. And that could cut off engaging in the act. So, with a positive action, you don't want to interrupt it. You actually want to go all the way through, because that's the most positive. Similarly, maybe you see someone that you want to be generous toward, but then they're gone when you get to where they were, and you're not able to actually engage in the act of generosity and bring that act to completion. And so that is also that being interrupted, not through any fault of your own, but still you couldn't actually give the money. You couldn't actually be of benefit. So it was a positive action, but it was kind of a positive mental action. You wanted to do something and you weren't able to. So for negative actions, we really don't want them to be complete. For positive actions, we do want them to be complete. Um, as I mentioned, they're different in terms of the heaviness or the weightiness of the action. And in particular, what is relevant is that at the time of death, as we were looking at in the previous verse, um, it is complete karmas that ripen at the time of death and have the power, due to their weightiness, have the power of actually establishing a rebirth in a particular realm, a particular kind of rebirth. An incomplete karma cannot do that, is not powerful enough to establish a rebirth. And that's why the difference is relevant. Oh my goodness. Any thoughts or questions? It's going to be really difficult not to use my hands. Any thoughts or questions?
The thing that I struggle with is that karma is like beginningless. I don't really grasp that.
Yeah, so it's true that we've been creating karma in all of our past lives. So there is this incredible store of unripened karma in the mind. That's definitely true. Um, when maybe in the next class, next week, what the good news kind of is about that is that when we as a practitioner, when we have a direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality, all of that karma, all in terms of that, all of that karma becomes um, kind of moot. It no longer can bring an effect. So you never actually deal with. It isn't actually, as you're saying, it really isn't possible to actually deal with. And we'll talk maybe today, maybe also next week about this idea of purification for negative karma, which is also an important concept in Buddhism. But um, we really can't, through that mechanism, we can't like individually purify or deal with all of our karma. Um, but when we, uh, as I say, when we have that direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality, we no longer have to worry about all of that storehouse of karma. It's the ground in which it exists is no longer able to bring its result. So that's the good news is that even though it is limitless in a way, we really don't have to worry about it. Well, I mean, there is a way in which there is a mechanism through which it becomes unnecessary to worry about. It's also true that karma has more power, that there's sort of a temporal relationship. So the karma that we create in this life is of primary importance in terms of the karma, with respect to, say, the karma that ripens at death. Um, it's true that we can't say it's the only thing that matters. We can't say that if we don't see the nature of reality directly in this life, which we may not, it's true that we can't say that none of our previous karma, a lot of which unfortunately is negative, we can't say that has no impact or no relevance. But the the sort of momentum of the choices, the actions that we do engage in over this life do play a really large role in the process of the ripening of karma at death. Um, so that's also, and as I said, we do have purification open to us, and that is incredibly powerful as a tool also for dealing with negative karma. And I think we'll be able to touch on that. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, so then we'll talk about ethical guidelines. So for the body, so as I mentioned, karma, the three doors of karma are the body, the speech, and the mind. And so there's a larger list. We've looked at previously the five lay vows, and those are going to come up again. But there's also another list of the ethical guidelines called the 10 non-virtuous actions. And they include the five lay vows, but there's five more things that are subtler that aren't suitable to be lay vows, but also, nonetheless, the Buddha said that we should really pay attention. Um, so when we say the body, we mean things that you physically do with your body. Um, and these are all things we've talked about before, so we're not going to really go into them again. Do not kill, do not steal, and do not commit sexual misconduct. Those were part of the five lay vows, and these are karmas, actions that you do engage in with your body. But we've addressed them. So unless there are questions that didn't get addressed, we'll just kind of skip over because it's the same understanding as before. So then there's ethical guidelines for our speech, and those do not lie has come up before. But then there's divisive speech, harsh speech, and idle speech. And these are three karmas, three actions that we can engage in with our speech that haven't come up before. So divisive speech is when you are um, talking to two people or two or more people, and your intent is to cause division with your speech. Your intent is to separate people from each other using your speech to say, oh, this person doesn't really like you, and so you it doesn't have to be untrue. You might be telling the truth, but if your goal is to cause sort of disharmony, then you've engaged in divisive speech. Harsh speech is any kind of speech that's meant to wound the other person. To be insulting, to be disrespectful, to cause some sort of not a physical wound, but to wound with your speech. And idle speech is interesting. The technical historical definition within Buddhism of idle speech is really to say anything, to talk about anything other than the Buddhist teachings, which is an impossible standard for lay people or anybody kind of in society. But the meaning of idle speech really is to kind of waste, God is only an example of idle speech. Kind of Venerable Urbina calls this rabbiting on about nothing, just kind of wasting other people's time with your speech. Of course, we have to do this to some degree. We kind of make small talk to make people feel comfortable, ask people how their day. But, if we're really interested in like, if we genuinely want to know how their day was and we're genuinely showing an interest in their life, then it really isn't idle speech. But, if we're like, oh, did you see the baseball game last night? Or oh, did you hear what this celebrity, who they're dating, what they're up to, whatever, these kind of just meaningless sorts of things that we might spend a lot of time. We're just kind of trying to pass the time. We just don't have anything at all truly meaningful to talk about. And we can't completely avoid this, but it's important to think about how much time we spend engaging in idle speech because it is wasting our time and it is wasting the time of other people if we just talk about, sports or celebrities or these kinds of just really silly things that maybe we spend a few minutes talking about, but we should kind of just really try to watch it because in one way what they'll say in the teachings is that this is the lightest of the negative karmas, because it doesn't really harm anyone directly, but it's the one that we're most likely to spend the most amount of time doing. We don't generally spend a lot of time going around lying to people or dividing people or screaming at people, but we spend a lot of time engaging in idle speech. So in that way, it can be quite heavy because it can be so pervasive. Any questions about the ethical guidelines for speech?
Where
Yes.
would gossip fall?
Gossip would fall under idle speech, unless, I mean, it could also be harsh speech if you're gossiping in like a really biting sort of way. Like gossiping could be just like talking about, what someone is doing but if it's like, can you believe that this person did such a stupid thing? Or then that sort of harsh, it would be both. It would be harsh speech and it would be because you know, um, yeah, and you're talking unkindly, you're talking in a harsh way, and it's also just kind of meaningless. So it isn't necessarily always both. If you are, um, if you're um, just kind of trying to just be cruel to someone, then that isn't really doesn't fall under idle speech. It really just falls under harsh speech. But if it's idle speech that has sort of a biting undertone, then I would say it could be both. So it's also true that we can engage in purely mental karma, so that we don't have to say or do anything in order for it to be a karmic action. There are things that we can accumulate karma just by engaging in a mental act. And these are covetousness, ill will, and wrong views. So covetousness is wanting things that belong to other people, trying to, kind of having this sort of greedy, covetous mind that's trying to put designs on other people's things. um, Really has to do, and could be also coveting not necessarily only inanimate objects, could be coveting a relationship with someone who's in another relationship, could be coveting a job or a position in society, something where there's status or power involved. Um, Ill will is just thinking ill about someone, not doing something to harm someone, but maybe hoping that they come to some harm, or fantasizing about them coming to some harm. You may not have any intention of actually doing anything, but you might, daydream about doing it, or you might wish that something bad happens to someone. And that's not constructive or beneficial, so it's something that we should really avoid. And I think wrong views has come up a bit, when we were talking about precious human rebirth, we were talking a bit about wrong views. Wrong views really is very strongly being convinced that the Buddha's teachings are false. So not having any kind of, it isn't the same as a skeptical mind, or a critically analyzing mind, where we're not sure and we're looking for the truth. We're investigating with an open mind. That's wonderful. But from the Buddhist perspective, if we say, well, that's all just nonsense, it's all just made up, that's a wrong view, because it cuts off that kind of inquiry. It cuts off the ability to change one's mind. It cuts off the possibility of moving in a different direction. So that would be wrong views. Would be like just deciding definitely that it's all just nonsense. Any thoughts or questions? Yes.
I was wondering if this falls under uh the negative thoughts of the mind. I sometimes get uh intrusive thoughts that say negative things about other people, and sometimes I agree with the thoughts that I hear. And sometimes it's really mean things. Am I creating negative karma here? Does this need to be purified, or?
So in general, I mean, I can't, I can't necessarily provide a definitive answer to that question. What I would say in general is that what's really important about karma is that it's intentional, right? So they do talk about, like, when a person, like, if a person has a fever, or if a person has, different kinds of ailments, they might see things that aren't there, or they might hear things that aren't there, due to the influence of an external condition. Um, and they would say that that's kind of more like a dream state, in a way, where where karma, it's also true that, like, in a purely unconscious dream state, we might there might be a dream about harming someone, and we don't accumulate karma in a situation like that either. So I do think that it's probably, helpful to maybe try to argue against it. If it does arise, I think that's probably beneficial. But I wouldn't, because if as you're saying, it's intrusive, and And I mean, everybody has intrusive thoughts. Sometimes, it's a very, to some degree, it's very common. People, and they're like, they talk about like, imagining what would it be like if I just stepped in front of this, truck or something. And you don't do it. And and that's not even, you're not even suicidal. Like people just kind of have these weird thoughts, that just happen sometimes. It's not totally uncommon. Um,
Yeah.
so I would say, it's so what I mean is, I wouldn't beat yourself up about it and think like, oh, this is some really terrible thing that, that it's happening, because it's broadly speaking, my understanding that it falls under more or less kind of one of the exceptions where it isn't really intentional.
More or less like a dream state, like you recommended. And so
Yeah.
you also, I heard you say that you would recommend me arguing against the mean things that I'm hearing.
I mean, like, you don't want to drive yourself, batty with it. You don't want to like,
I
get, but
I do. That's what I've been doing, but I just was curious
yeah.
to hear you say that and to hear that I'm doing the right thing by your approval. That was really helpful. So, okay.
All right. So, okay. So now we're going to talk about the four features of karma. And this applies to all karmas, positive or negative. Um, Karma can be understood to operate in these four ways. So the first way is that karma is definite, and here definite means definite to be experienced. Why did I guess because I have a different setting on this presentation. So let me fix that. Okay, so karma is understood to function in these four ways. One, when you create a karma, it is definite to be experienced. Again, negative karma, positive karma, the result is definite to be experienced. Although, here's kind of where we can talk a bit about um, purification, because it is the case that if we purify the karma, then it won't be experienced. Then um, so it's definite to be experienced unless there is what I would call an interfering force. So with an interfering force with regard to a negative karma, there is purification practice. Um, we offer one type of purification practice here at the center on Zoom, Monday through Friday at 9 p.m., which is called Vajrasattva practice. Vajrasattva is a particular enlightened being, and it's understood that that enlightened being, when they were practicing, they made very strong prayers that their enlightenment would be able to be used in order to help sentient beings overcome their negative karma. So, with regard to purification, generally, what the idea generally is that you want to develop a sense of regret, understanding that the negative karma was a negative karma, and it was unskillful. It did cause some harm. And so it isn't, recognizing that it's not in alignment with your spiritual goals. That, killing, stealing, lying, etc., these negative karmas, they're not who you want to be. They're not positive, they are negative. And, we regret that there was an unskillful action that brought some harm. If we don't do that, then we're likely to continue to engage in that kind of action. If we don't think about it in that way as regrettable, then we're likely to continue that habit pattern. So, what we're trying to do with purification practice is break that habit pattern, to kind of interrupt that momentum that that habit pattern has. Um, and a really powerful way that we do that is by generating regret. Um, and then, there's other aspects to it, with regard, but in general, you want to have that regret, and then you want to engage in some remedial action, some beneficial action. That is, so the purpose of the remedial action or the beneficial action is to kind of create a new habit pattern, to create a new um, way of relating, to do something that's beneficial and not negative. So this would be, some meditation, some recitation of mantra, something that's constructive and beneficial. Um, and then you want to engage in a process of reliance. Here, reliance is has different aspects, but again, we rely on developing a new way, a new motivation, a motivation of being of benefit, being of benefit to sentient beings. We also rely on the power of enlightened activity to help. So, we generate this attitude that is beneficial for sentient beings and also understands the power of enlightened mind, enlightened activity. And then we engage in um, the resolve. So we've got regret, reliance, the remedy, and resolve, the four R's, you could call them. So, we have to generate regret, then we generate reliance, we engage in a remedial action, and then we resolve to really try not to engage in that negative karma again in the future. Um, and when we do that, we want to be skillful. We don't want to necessarily always, under all circumstances, kind of say, I will never engage, in this negative action ever again for the rest of my life. What we want to really do is say, well, for the next hour, I'm really going to watch my mind and I'm really going to make sure that I don't engage in that negative action. Because this idea of resolve should be followed up by mindfulness, vigilance, really making good on that resolve. And it's too difficult. In the beginning, it's too difficult to maintain that for really long periods of time. So we want to increase those periods of time, over time, but we kind of want to start with more realistic, promises with regard to our sense of resolving not to engage in that negative action again. And again, as I mentioned, it's also possible to interrupt positive karma, which we don't want to do. So negative karma, we do want to interrupt that momentum. But if we regret, for example, if we regret a positive action, now we've interrupted the positive momentum of that action, which would have brought a beneficial result. But now that we've regretted it, we've reduced the power of that positive action, and that we don't want to do. So it does work both ways. We want to purify negative actions. The word purify is the wrong word to use for an action that itself was positive, but we can use the same sort of mechanism, the same psychological mechanism by for example, engaging in regret or kind of thinking, well, that went really badly. And so not only do I regret it, I was kind to someone and then they were rude to me in return, right? And so I regret ever being kind to them and I will never be kind to them again. It's the same kind of psychological mechanism that we're using for purifying negative karma, but now we're kind of not purifying, but harming or reducing the impact of in the same way. So really important to think about how to not interrupt positive karma. But the word definite doesn't mean inevitable, because there are ways in which it can be interrupted. For what it kind of means is, an analogy would be if you have a ball on a table and you hit the ball with, good force, 100%, that that ball is going to fall off the table. You don't have to sit there and watch it. You know that it was hit with sufficient force that that will definitely happen. But you also know that you can pick it up. You also know that you can put something in the way before it gets to the edge. And so that result is definite. It will absolutely happen because you set that in motion. But it's fixable. You can prevent it at the same time. Both things can be true. And that's what is meant by this. Um, Similar is something that we've addressed, where a positive karma can only ripen in a beneficial way, and a negative karma can only ripen in a suffering way. It can never be otherwise. You can never have a positive karma that leads to a suffering result. You can never have a negative karma that leads to a beneficial, positive result. There is a relationship between the intention, the kind of energy of the intention when the action was engaged in that created the karma, and the result that it will eventually bring. And then karma is individual, meaning that if a karma is ripening for me or you or any individual sentient being, then we can say that at some previous point in the continuity of that mind that is associated with that form, an action was engaged in by that mind that was inhabiting one of the incarnations in the line of incarnations that that this mind is now, experiencing as this particular incarnation. So we all have minds that are beginningless and endless. We've talked about that, which means that our past lives have been beginningless, but they are also sequential, right? So in before the birth in this life, our mind was having one specific experience in one specific previous incarnation. And that had a lifetime, which means it had an origin for that specific one lifetime. Immediately before that, there was a different lifetime, individual specific lifetime. So there are these histories, you could say these unique karmic histories of each individual being. Right before this was the experience. Right before that, this was the experience, and so on. And if a karma is ripening for me today, then by definition, the mind that's inhabiting my body right now is the mind that inhabited one of that specific line of incarnations, and an action was engaged in, a skillful action, an unskillful action. So someone else didn't create that karma. It wasn't my neighbor's line of incarnations. It was my own. And that means that the karma that I create in this life, can only ripen when this mind that I'm experiencing inhabits another, a new sentient being's form in the future. So there is this sequential nature to our individual incarnations, and karma can only ripen within that sort of line of incarnations. Um, and then it expands over time. So this is true for positive and negative karmas. for negative karmas, that's a problem, because the longer that we go without purifying a negative karma, the impact of that negative karma when it does ripen, it builds. So it's wonderful. It's amazing that the Buddha taught purification methods, but we need to actually practice them. And we want to try to practice them quickly, rather than waiting. Of course, we're kind of stuck with the things that we did a long time ago that we didn't realize were negative, but still we try to purify them strongly with intense or strong regret and so on, really trying to practice practice strongly. And then with regard to positive karma, this is good. Even a small positive karma can bring a very large positive result in the future, because it too expands over time. Yes.
Just to go back just really quick, I didn't write down what is the third action of the body, that there's wrong view, ill will, and what was the other one?
Of the mind, negative
Of the
karma.
mind.
Yeah, covetousness, ill will, and wrong views.
Okay, the covetousness, that's the one I missed. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So the next verse is, so that was the section on karma, and this next verse says, led by this pure thought, meaning if we remember the previous verse, it said, finding firm and definite conviction in this, please bless me to avoid even the slightest negativity and accomplish all virtuous deeds. So that's the pure thought of, on the basis of understanding positive and negative karma, and the effects that it will bring. Then I have to be really mindful. I have to be really alert, and I have to be very cautious of guarding my three doors, guarding my body, my speech, and my mind, so that I avoid even the slightest negativity, and I take every opportunity that I have to engage in virtue. Those are very important practices. And here it says the root of the teachings is keeping the pratimoksha vows. The pratimoksha vows are the individual liberation vows. So that basically means the refuge commitments and the 5 lay vows. That's the root or the heart of our practice, is keeping the ethical commitments. So that's the section on karma. Any questions? Okay, so if we go on then to the next verse, so we've covered now the small scope, the initial scope, where, as we said, the goal of a practitioner on the small scope is to avoid lower realm rebirths, to avoid the worst kinds of suffering that exist within ordinary cyclic existence. Uh, and really, you do that by becoming deeply familiar, by mastering all of the topics that we've talked about so far. Precious human rebirth, death and impermanence, and karma. And then And also understanding. There's also kind of understanding the shortcomings of um, the lower realms, the really understanding why a person would want to overcome, um, why a person would want to close the door to the lower realms is also kind of part of that sort of inner technology that's necessary to accomplish the aim of a practitioner of the small scope. But here on the middle scope, we aren't only trying to close the door to the lower realms. We are now trying to understand that even the upper realms are disadvantageous. Um, because as I said, one of the things that a person on the small scope does is they familiarize their mind with the disadvantages of taking rebirth in the lower realms. Um, but they haven't really familiarized their mind with the disadvantages of taking rebirth in the upper realms. And compared to enlightenment, those upper realms are still disadvantageous. They're not as good as the upper realms. Um, so here it says seeking samsaric pleasure. Samsaric pleasures mean, essentially pleasures of the senses, devoting one's life to the pursuit of, good food, being comfortable, also kind of mental pleasures like being praised, being powerful, being important, being comfortable, all of these sorts of um, sensory, as we said, you've got the five bodily senses and you've got the mental sense power. So trying to just please one or more of the senses are kind of samsaric pleasures. Um, and when we're focused on that, then we are blocked from we might not be blocked from upper realm rebirths, but we're blocked from full enlightenment. We're blocked from the bliss. Here it says, the bliss of liberation, because we're caught up in ordinary cyclic existence. We are thinking, that all of that framework, that mental framework, is taking at its core the idea that there is some combination of circumstances that is good enough, that if we can just get the right kind of job, that we can get, the right kind of relationship, we can get, the right kind of wealth and status, and then everything is great. That's kind of the inherent assumption in seeking, in being overly preoccupied with those sorts of things, is that it's really possible to put together some combination of them where everything is fine. But it says it isn't possible, that no matter what combination you put together, compared to enlightenment, things are not perfect. Things are not as good as they could be. Um, and really, if we look back at, the suffering of change, that's kind of what we're pursuing, changeable suffering, because they are fleeting. And if we don't stop engaging in them, these things that we thought were happiness will actually become unpleasant. If we keep eating the pizza, if we keep, watching the movie or listening to the CD or talking to our best friend and it never stops, we will become bothered by those actions. Those actions themselves will agitate, will disturb the mind, because they come along with their own kind of suffering that becomes noticeable at a certain point. That point might be different under different circumstances, but it will become noticeable at some point if it never ends. So they're really, these samsaric pleasures are really changeable suffering. Um, so here we're trying to now familiarize our mind with all of this, understanding that it isn't just lower realm rebirths that are problematic or disadvantageous, but it's also even upper realm rebirths. We have to put an end even to upper realm rebirths and really dedicate ourselves for the bliss of liberation. So this is a middle scope practitioner's goal or motivation. Any thoughts or questions about? So this is the idea I think we've talked about this idea of renunciation or definite emergence, the wish to definitely emerge from suffering. And this is the idea where we started along the path of renunciation or definite emergence, even on the small scope, where you know we might have previously we might have thought that well, it's okay if I lie, it's okay if I cheat, it's okay if I engage in fraud, as long as I look out for myself, as long as I get what I want, as long as that makes me happy, then that's fine. We give up those things, and that's a form of renunciation. We give up those things when we realize that those ways of behaving, those habit patterns, those tendencies, those are the kinds of habit patterns and tendencies that give rise to lower realm rebirths. They might seem like there's some benefit in the moment, but ultimately it's not worth it. Ultimately, it leads to something that's much worse. So that's a type or a level of renunciation. And here we're just sort of deepening that renunciation. And we are saying even the karmic causes of upper realm rebirths, which are not killing, stealing, lying, they're actually positive actions, but they are certain kinds of positive actions that are still not, and we'll get into that maybe next week, but they're not like the best kinds of actions. They're good and they lead to upper, compared to the lower realms, they're good and they lead to upper realm rebirths. But the upper realm is not something really to strive for, isn't really something to be interested in, aside from the fact that it can give a practitioner the time and the space to finish the path to enlightenment. That's certainly true. And for that reason, we might have a wise, realistic way of setting ourselves up for those good future rebirths, but we're not doing it because we want more of good food and good music and, pleasant sensory experiences and so on. That's not the goal. The goal is recognizing that it's the best, that it's a good way of finishing the training that's necessary, but it serves no other useful purpose. It isn't a good in and of itself. Yep.
So if someone ends up in a upper realm, they can actually do meditations in this upper realm and finish it off. This is totally news to me.
So
And
mhm.
but having it be like a better condition to it, that makes sense that it would be better conditions than the earth, you know?
Well, so the human realm is actually considered an upper realm rebirth, because the lower realms are the animal realm, the spirit realm, or the hungry ghost or spirit realm, and then the hell realm. Those are the
Yeah,
three lower realms. So
yeah,
anything that's not that is the upper realm. So we
yeah.
actually do have an upper realm rebirth. Um, there are also other upper realms. And generally, those, for the most part, those are not realms where we would aspire to take rebirth. For example, the the God and demigod realms, in the form realm, in the desire realm, the form realm, which these are things we haven't talked about, and really it's too kind of specific, but humans are part of the desire realm. Animals are also part of the desire realm. There's what are called the god and demigod uh, parts of the desire realm. Then there's also, you've got the form realm and the formless realm. None of those experiences are really beneficial for spiritual growth.
For
Um,
meditation and spiritual growth, that none of
yeah.
them are good. It's really only Earth that's good for it,
Well, human, because human, it's understood that there are many uh, places where there are humans.
other
So
than Earth. Yeah.
yeah, other
Oh,
than
okay.
this one Earth, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's places where humans
Yeah.
exist, and they might
Yeah.
look different, and but they have kind of a similar sort of karmic experience. They have sort of a similar range of karmic experiences. Um,
Yeah.
Whether they might have, three arms or something, who knows? But but they have kind of a similar range of karmic experiences. And that's why they would be classed as human and not animal, because their mind is sort of similarly sharp. They have the ability to meditate and so on. Um, and then there's also what are called the pure realms, and those are very kind of specific. There's also some advantages to taking rebirth in the pure realms. Those um, there are some pure realms that a relatively ordinary practitioner, through practice, can accomplish, can create the karmic conditions to take rebirth in. They are the abodes of enlightened beings. They are the kind of environment created by enlightened mind. Um, and so some of those are, there's advantages to that. That's sort of another option, that is different than the form or formless realms, because it's a pure realm.
Okay.
So then I've read in teachings that there are some places where the gods can go. I don't know if it's Pure Lands or wherever for teachings. Are they in a different world other than the regular world of the devas?
Um, I mean, I would think it's generally, I mean, the enlightened beings, they can certainly pervade all of the realms. Um, So certainly they are working to benefit ordinary beings. Um, in general, the experiences, um, so in general, broadly speaking, you know, the experiences that most desire realm gods and demigods are having are not particularly conducive to spiritual practice. It certainly could be that there are some exceptions, because of certain karmas that are very strong, very like, very strong predispositions for practice, that they might have certain things. It's also, there's there are bodhisattvas that have access to the Sambhogakaya aspect of enlightened beings, but that's not the same sort of thing as just taking rebirth in the god or demigod realm. That's being a spiritual practitioner of a particular level, who, because of the level that they are at, they can receive teachings from enlightened beings through a subtler energetic form of that enlightened being. But those are generally humans who have achieved that level of spiritual development. Um, and then they are able to take teachings from that energetic aspect of enlightened mind. I don't know if that could be something that is relevant, but
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. So the last we will introduce the concept of bodhicitta. So we've now just kind of in that one when we talked about renunciation, um, that's kind of the middle scope, is this deeper level of renunciation that applies to the upper realm. Once a practitioner completely loses interest in those kind of mundane samsaric pleasures like food and drink and all of the things that please the senses, and their only motivation is liberation, then they've mastered the intermediate or the middle scope. Um, so that's we kind of just did that with just that one slide, that one concept, because that's what a middle scope practitioner is trying to do, is to kind of become disinterested, become wary of cyclic existence as a whole. Um, they say it's kind of like putting a bale of hay in front of a lion, right? The lion does, maybe is interested in hunting down a gazelle or something, but the bale of hay, like, what am I going to do with this? Like, they have no interest. They would just yawn and kind of go back to sleep if you put a bale of hay in front of a lion. And that's the attitude that we're kind of meant to try to develop in the middle scope with regard to sensory things that are just purely sensory pleasures. To think of like, well, who cares? Like what I care about is enlightenment. What I care about is the bliss of liberation, not, that's what I'm going to go hunt down, not like the sort of fleeting, meaningless enjoyment of food and so on. Um, but now we know that we've got the great scope, the third scope in the lamrim is the great scope. And one of the distinguishing characteristics of the great scope is that the spiritual practitioner now realizes that it isn't sufficient to just seek enlightenment for themselves alone. As it says here, this practitioner realizes, just as I have fallen into the sea of samsara, so have all mother migratory beings. Please bless me to see this, train in supreme bodhicitta, and bear the responsibility of freeing migratory beings. Migratory beings just means, you know, ordinary beings, because they are, every time they die, they take, under the influence of karma mixed with delusion, they will take another ordinary birth. They will die and take another ordinary form in the desire realm or the form realm or the formless realm. And so here, this great scope practitioner is recognizing that this is the existential condition of every sentient being, not just myself. And so it isn't sufficient to just seek my own liberation, to just put an end to cyclic existence only for just myself, because everyone else is in that same boat. And here, mother is something that we'll look at when we next we'll be also begin with bodhicitta. Next class we'll go into bodhicitta in more detail at the beginning of next week's class. But bodhicitta, I think we defined it in one of the previous classes. Bodhi means awakening, and citta means mind, so it means the mind of awakening. But the definition is the wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception, every sentient being. And mother here refers to this idea that our consciousness is beginningless and endless. And so too are the consciousnesses of every other sentient being. So from that perspective, from that understanding, every other sentient being has a mind that many times that mind was inhabiting the form of our own mother. That we were in relation to that sentient being in the parent-child, relationship. And the mother is kind of an archetype in this sense for kindness, for love, for compassion that we can kind of see in the world. They're kind of a stand-in for a really caring, really loving sort of person. And so, if your own mother was in danger, you would be motivated. You would be interested in, if you and your mother were walking, in the woods or something, and she was about to fall over the edge of a cliff, you would reach out, you would grab, you would pull her back from that precipice. Um, you would free her from that danger. And that's the kind of attitude that we are meant to try to train in with regard to every sentient being. We're meant to kind of think that it isn't sufficient that I accomplish my own enlightenment and leave all of these kind mother sentient beings to suffer in samsara, but I must actually, as it says here, bear the responsibility, willingly, voluntarily take on the responsibility of freeing all mother migratory beings from that existential condition. And there are specific meditative ways that we train in that, and that's what we will talk about next week. Um, any thoughts or questions?
I do have a question actually from the last class. If you don't want to answer it, that's totally fine. I mean, if it doesn't make sense right now, but I wanted to better understand what are the characteristics of guru devotion?
Um, it's a large topic that this class, the most comprehensive book that if you were looking to study that as a topic, Lama Zopa Rinpoche has a book called The Heart of the Path. And that as a book is probably the best presentation of guru devotion or how to properly rely, just so other people might, we talked about it, I think, or called it how to properly rely on the spiritual guide. Those two terms are interchangeable. In general,
What's that title again? Sorry, that
the
book?
the heart of the path by
Okay,
Lama
thank you.
Zopa Rinpoche. Um, in general, the idea is that a person, when a student takes someone as their teacher, as their guru, which it doesn't mean that, oh, this person is a teacher, they are a guru. The student decides, this is my teacher, this is my guru, this is the person that I'm choosing, that I'm going to create this guru disciple relationship with. So we have the power to decide. It isn't that, like, oh, just because this person was an abbot or they were thus, they're well respected, they're well known. That doesn't mean that they're a suitable guru for oneself. We have to check. We have to decide that this person is a suitable guru for oneself. And then we the main training that we are meant to embark on is to see that person as not an ordinary sentient being, as not just another learned person, not just someone who has a lot of knowledge, but to train our mind in seeing them as an enlightened being, as someone who is the embodiment of enlightenment itself. Um, Meaning then that all of their actions are the actions of an enlightened being, that they don't make mistakes in, in the way that an ordinary sentient being would. So it's a very challenging um, training, and it's not easy. It's not meant to be, it's meant to be a practice that grows, that develops over time, that deepens over time. But we're the ones that drive that process. We're the ones that decide if we feel like we're ready to take on that training and with whom we are ready to take on that training. Um, but that is the essence of it, is that they become that we no longer see them as just this man or woman who has a lot of knowledge, more than me, but we see them actually, we train in seeing them as an actual enlightened being. Did that kind of answer your question? There are specific ways in which that training manifests, like how to train in our words and our actions, and I mean, but that's the general idea.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yes, Jennifer.
So I didn't get these two definitions of covetousness and ill will. Um,
Yeah, so
can
covetousness
you
is
explain? Yeah.
So covetousness is basically like looking at something that doesn't belong to a person, something that somebody else owns or somebody else has, or characterizes someone else's experience, like they are married to this person or they are the president of this organ, and just kind of wanting that for oneself, kind of feeling like I need that to.
Jealousy.
Yeah, in a way, it's a jealous, kind of envious, but
And
yeah, it's that sort of energy. Yeah. It isn't just like, it's wanting it for oneself, is like really thinking that ought to be mine. I ought to have that. Not, it's maybe a little bit further than jealousy, because like, um, jealousy is like, oh, I wish that I could have that, but covetousness is like that, really, that ought to be mine. I should have that. It's like it's like
then and
it's like feeling bereft, feeling kind of um, you know, it's sort of a neediness.
huh. And then the ill will, what is that's just wanting bad things to happen to other people?
Yeah, it's just kind of delighting in, like thinking, oh, it's great that that bad thing happened to them, even though maybe you had nothing to do with it, but you like, they tripped and you don't like them and you were like, haha, they fell, and you were like really happy that that happened. Or you kind of imagine doing something bad to them, even though you may never do it. But yeah, just sort of thinking harmful thoughts about someone.
Oh, okay. Okay, harmful thoughts. All right.
Or thoughts of harm, thoughts of them coming to some harm, or being happy, even just rejoicing or delighting mentally in harm that did come to them, would be ill
Yeah.
will.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Anything else for today? All right, so we will go back, we'll go in there. So there's meditative processes that help a person to actually generate bodhicitta. So we'll be talking about that, and we'll also we'll go into the nature of reality and how to kind of understand that more deeply next in the last class as well.
Okay.
All right, well, have a good weekend. And
Thank
we'll
you very much, Venerable.
see you guys next week.